Reverend Chris Langeveld, who is a priest of the Roman Catholic Church in South Africa, whose parish is in Phiri, in Johannesburg. Hello, Chris.
Hi.
How long have you been involved with the blacks in Soweto?
I began my ministry in 1980 in Soweto. I was appointed to a place called Phiri, where I've remained ever since and worked there. So it's basically been 6 years now that I've been involved in the black community in Soweto.
Mm-hmm. What were the conditions generally under the state of emergency up to the time when you left?
Well, when I left, which was in '86, it was just before the declaration of the second state of emergency, as it was called. The situation was very tense. In fact, one could say it was bizarre. What you had was virtual military occupation of the township and a war that was being conducted against children. I could put it in that way. It was largely a war conducted against children. You had the strange spectacle nearly every day of young children ranging from anything upward from 8 years to 19 years old, confronting heavily armed police, military, with stones and sticks were their only weapons against heavily armed military people who disrupted their meetings at schools, who patrolled the schools, who guarded them, shot tear gas canisters into the school whenever the students had their meetings, who disrupted funerals. It was just a situation of absolute chaos, tension. Yeah, that's basically the condition I left Soweto in. I think something which was more dramatic towards the end when I left was the gang warfare that was going on, and by that I mean the police had, it was suspected by many of the community, had been bought over by the police, criminal gangs, to attack the houses of the different activists. We had death squads at the time. Just 3 days before I left, a number of students that I knew were ambushed and attacked and shot at by a particular gang called the Makabazas. And it was rumored by people that they were in the pay of the police. And I think the purpose of all that activity was to incite different organizations against each other. I think you would have heard that at that point there was a lot of tension, so-called, between UDF activists and Azapa activists, and I think a lot of it was actually spearheaded by the police through the form of these gangs and so on. It was a situation of bloodshed, to put it that way. As a priest I would have noticed it, because virtually every weekend we were called out to conduct funerals of one or other person who had been shot, and it was usually a child. And yeah, it was a situation of bloodshed and violence. And the violence, I might add, was largely the violence of the police and the army.
What is the condition of the church now? What is the attitude of the church now towards the state's policies, towards apartheid? I mean, historically the church has been listless, and it tended not to voice opinion against the laws of the state. Do you think that situation has changed now?
Well, look, I think when we speak of the church, we have to actually define what we're talking about. If we're referring to the church leadership, then I would say we're talking about a group that have made a number of statements over the years to express their disapproval of the whole apartheid regime, to show its inconsistency with the gospel, etc., etc. But if by the church we mean the people, then we're talking about another reality. And I think if we look at all the churches across the board in South Africa, 80% of their membership is made up of the oppressed and exploited people in our country, the black people in our country. Now, if you're talking about that sector, we're talking about a very different attitude towards what's going on in the country, and it's from that 80%, I think, that a very different message is coming through. It's a message that is mediated through the day-to-day struggles of the people who are grappling with their Christianity in a very different way on account of the conditions which persist in the township. And the Kairos document, for instance, is a manifestation of that different way of thinking about South Africa. People have come, especially the black Christians, have come to analyze Christianity, its role, its complicity in a way pacifying the people in their struggle for liberation through the use of slogans like reconciliation, a false conception of love of your enemy, a lack of analysis as to what the root causes of the problem were. And I think black Christians are seeing through that and are demanding a very different kind of Christianity, what they in the Kairos document would call prophetic Christianity.
Yes. I see. And what is the attitude of the white Christians in general?
I think white Christians are a very divided group as well. You would have those white Christians who would support the mainline policies of both this regime. You'd have a minority of white Christians who see the contradictions and from a liberal vantage point would criticize the violations of human rights, as they call them in South Africa. But you also have a small number of fairly radical whites who commit themselves to the objectives of building a non-racial and democratic South Africa. So you've actually got a very mixed bag, but I'd say on the whole the majority of white Christians would go along with the basic reform, in inverted commas, policy of Botha, and who just don't understand what the basic struggle about is in South Africa.
White churchmen have always been challenged, that is the white church people who profess to be liberal, who are in sympathy with the struggling people of South Africa. They've always been challenged to express, to define their radical opinions within their racial groupings. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think one of the problems with a lot of the white liberal clergy is that they speak a language of theology which has traditionally been a language of values, you know, like kingdom, justice, peace, love, all these things. Now, those things aren't bad in themselves, talking about those values, but they remain abstract and general. And in a situation of bloodshed like ours, a situation of extreme repression and brutality on the part of the state, one has to give content to things like that. What does it mean to love in a situation where people are exploited and oppressed? One needs a concrete mediation of what those things mean. I think this is why a number of the more radical church people have seen that the Freedom Charter, basically in a real sweat and blood way, gives flesh to what some of these values in the abstract could mean. People in their own language have said that they want housing for all. They want the doors of learning and culture to be opened. All these clauses of the Freedom Charter are very concrete expressions of what people in their own language are saying about the need for transformation in South Africa. And that kind of thing gives content to abstract slogans like justice and peace. I think that's the point, that these things have to be contextualized. And the way to contextualize them is not for the church to adopt its own program or political stance. The people have evolved those, and they articulated their aspirations to be free and a method to be free through those organizations. And it's a task of the church to seriously begin to listen to what the people's organizations are saying about the way to become free.
The report of the group sent by the British Council of Churches in 1985 hints mildly at the possibility that the word of the Lord has been wrongly preached over the years. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think I have to go from the background of the Kairos document because I was very much part of that process. And the very first chapter of the Kairos document is very clear. It critiques what it calls state theology. And what they mean by that simply is that the Christian message or the Word of God has been used for ideological purposes to justify all the actions of the state, the violence and the aggression and the injustice. And in the name of so-called Western Christian civilization, they've legitimized the brutal killing of people opposed to those policies. So they've equated the Word of God, in a sense, with the maintenance of a particular political system which is responsible for the oppression and death of so many of our people. Another dimension of the Word of God and the way it's been tailored is that critique in a chapter called State Theology, the Church Theology. And Church Theology really is, in essence, a kind of liberal political interpretation of the Christian message. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that at no stage can Christianity loosen itself from some kind of political analysis of the situation. Whenever you announce the Word of God, there's implied in that message some kind of political analysis. Now, if you're not conscious of what analysis is behind it, you're going to lead people into a lot of trouble. And that's happened with the position on state theology, where Afrikaner nationalism, where imperialism formed the backdrop of that message. Similarly, liberal ideology has formed the backdrop of state theology, whereas prophetic theology has a much more radical analysis. The point is you've got to justify that particular analysis in terms of its ability to deal with suffering at a concrete level in that society. And a lot of Christians are saying actually the radical analysis comes closer to understanding the root causes of the problem. Put simply, if you want to really love your neighbor, you must understand the root causes of what's oppressing your neighbor. And to be truly loving, then you have to eliminate the root causes of people's oppression and exploitation, and that's what justifies a radical analysis in those terms.
Having mentioned the Kairos document, I've noticed that it is quite scathing about what it describes as church theology, the old order of theology. Now, is this the kind of approach that you would associate with liberal politicians or people like Helen Suzman, for instance?
Yeah, I think most definitely that's the kind of sort of theological justification that's given for a liberal program. And I think the big problem with that is it's not a personal attack against those people. The problem with that particular kind of outlook is that it's based on a program where people are not actually involved with those who are oppressed and suffering in organizing for freedom. They're sitting on the sidelines in privileged positions, judging the action of the oppressed and exploited, using abstract sort of values and terms to judge the action of the oppressed. And so you get cant phrases like reconciliation, the need for peace, the need for justice. And when you look through these liberal phrases, like, say, justice, and examine it very carefully and see what they mean, usually what's spoken of is a justice that comes from on top. It's the justice that's paternalistically, I could put it that way, given out as a gift almost to the oppressed who are demanding justice. Whereas I think the other way of looking at it, which is against the traditional church way of approaching it, is that justice comes from below. People actually achieve their own justice through fighting for their own liberation. So in a way, justice comes from the bottom. If you look at this concept of reconciliation that is bandied around a lot, the impression is that there's a quarrel between two equals. And the point is that in South Africa it's not the case. The majority of the oppressed and exploited are hounded and are killed and are oppressed by those on top. So if there's any talk about reconciliation, the first has to be repentance on the side of those who are administrating this violence through the army and the police, etc.
Tell me, what difficulties do you particularly experience in ministering in Soweto, for instance, from the authorities?
Well, I think we went through a very interesting experience at one stage. When I first started off my ministry in Soweto, I was regarded with a lot of respect by West Rand administration officials, by the police and so on. You know, this concept of Muruti or Mfundisi, you know, that kind of respect thing that was given. And I noticed a complete change in their attitude once we made available church premises like the hall or the church itself for people's meetings. For instance, if a trade union wanted to hold a meeting, they'd approach us for the use of our hall. And similarly, the student movement did the same, and the civic associations. And the more and more we began to identify with the organizations of the people, the more we found ourselves alienated from the police, etc., which was a good thing. I'm not against that. But we noticed a complete change in attitude. They then, from then on, started regarding us as communists. The whole tenor changed. They treated us like rubbish. In fact, they enjoyed humiliating us in public, and the only reason for that was because we had taken sides. That was what became clear. We as priests, as clergy, had taken sides with the struggle of the people and had said this is a just struggle, whereas the struggle to maintain the system was unjust. Once you've taken sides, then you become a victim with the victims in a way, and that we experienced.
How would you analyze the people, the black people themselves? Do you think they accept you readily, or is it because they perhaps do not know how to treat you?
Look, I think your acceptance in the black community was one that had to be earned. Earned in the sense that people had to see your commitment, had to see your identification with them. But one of the privileges of being able to work in a place like Soweto, speaking as a white, is that one begins to see that racism is not a problem of the black people. Racism is actually the problem of the whites. Blacks never treated me as something apart, as some belonging to some special racial grouping. They regarded me as a human being, and that was my experience in Soweto. I can give you an example, tons of examples, and the one that stands out most in my mind was about 3 years ago when we had to bury a young COSA student who had been shot by the police. That was a funeral of about 10,000 people, and we were at one stage stopped by the police. They tear gassed the funeral, and I had 10 people in the crowd, students, who actually lifted me right out of the crowd, carried me, put their arms under me, and took me to safety and protected me. And I spent a night in one home being looked after so that I would avoid being in any way mishandled by the police. Now, I mean, that kind of thing happens. Another very good illustration of that would be a young girl 4 years ago, a white girl, was picked up by a white motorist. She was hitching. And she was raped by this man and dropped about 1/4 kilometer outside of Soweto. She walked in a dazed fashion back into Soweto and was noticed by some people walking in there. They took her into the house. And this is documented, you can find it in the newspaper. They cleaned her, they washed her, they put her to bed. And the next morning, they took her back to her home. Now, this gives you some indication of the non-racism of black people, I think. Through quite a long process before reaching a publication stage. Basically, what happened was that a number of Christians and theologians, largely located in the black areas, came together to reflect after the declaration of the first state of emergency on a number of issues that were challenging the churches at that point. I mean, you had priests and other Christian people having to bury, week after week, bury young people shot, the victims of police brutality and army violence. You had this ongoing struggle of the people to articulate their demands in essentially a non-violent way for a democratic South Africa, and you were confronted with this massive campaign on the part of the state to smash all this organization in the most violent manner. And up to then, the churches really hadn't responded fully in terms of what they were capable of. If you look at their resources, or you look at the person power that they have, they were significantly, their voice was missing from the voices of others in the sphere of, say, education. COSAS made its voice heard very clearly. The workers were making their voices heard very clearly through the action of the trade unions and so on. And so they decided, some theologians and some people working in these townships, to come together to reflect on this state of crisis. one of the things that was very obvious to us was the way in which Christianity was being manipulated by, especially the media, the mass media. You would find ministers of religion using this text of Romans 13 night after night on television after the declaration of the state of emergency to justify the fact that people should not get involved in politics at all. So it came across as a censure of what people were doing. You had church leaders simply articulating once again old slogans about reconciliation and peace. And we who were working at a grassroots level felt this was totally inadequate to deal with the crisis with which we were confronted. And so we started reflecting on how best to meet the challenge. And initially a group of 10 and later a group of 50 came together and isolated a number of themes. And we said what is important at this stage is to begin to look at the way in which Christianity is being manipulated by the state to give legitimation to the whole system of apartheid. We also said we needed a criticism of traditional church theology, which seemed to rest on a sort of liberal analysis of the problem in South Africa. And on the other hand, we had to also account for the fact that there was a new theology that was beginning to grow up amongst the masses of the people, a new way of relating their faith with their political practice or their political action. And there was a new way that was developing in the townships of celebrating traditional Christian ritual, etc., that was linked up with that very struggle. So we needed to find a way of presenting this in a clear form, in a way of a declaration, to make it clear that Christianity could not be or should not be manipulated by the state in its program of enforcing apartheid. So gradually, through months and months of discussion, it was actually 3 months, and hard work, trying to articulate our practice, we came out with this document, which is actually a critique of the present crisis and the role of the church in that crisis. I think the most significant thing about the Kairos document is that it challenges the churches to completely re-look at its resources, its structures, its theology in the light of that crisis. Because that crisis has become a turning point for everybody. It's a time of truth when we have to face the truth as it really is and not hide behind all sorts of vague positions. And it was a very serious situation of bloodshed in which we had no time to dally anymore. We had to take action. And that's really the background to the formation of this Kairos document.
Yes. Last year, Mrs. Thatcher declared that sanctions would be immoral since they would hurt the blacks. The Kairos document argues that the church should provide moral leadership for the oppressed people of South Africa. What would you say to the call for sanctions?
You know, in the context of South Africa, if you had to ask this question to ordinary people in Soweto, I think the first thing they would say is that this kind of moral sensitivity which people are suddenly discovering in the West sticks in their throat because it's absolutely hypocritical. What people are saying is, why are you all of a sudden concerned about black suffering? Black people have suffered for centuries in South Africa. And what protests have really been made? What efforts above protests have been made to ensure the downfall of this system of apartheid and the construction of a non-racial and democratic South Africa? So that's the first point. The second point is, if you really want to know what black people are feeling about their suffering and whether they're prepared to take on more suffering in changing the system, why don't you consult the true leadership of the people and find out what they really think? Consult UDF, consult COSATU, which is the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and find out what the people themselves are actually saying. Ask the students and the student organizations. And you'll see that they all of them, I did consult them before coming out to Europe, all of them were unanimous in the decision that sanctions at this point was important. But to put that into context, I think it's important to see that people at home are aware of the fact that the sanctions debate has only come up now, after the massive advances that the people have made organizationally, etc., to put pressure on the state. And if it weren't for that, this debate of sanctions wouldn't be there. What I'm saying is that people see sanctions simply as a complementary action to the action they've already taken inside the country. So people were prepared to suffer long before the sanctions debate came up. The fact that people joined trade unions, the fact that they joined civic associations, that they joined women's organizations, the fact that they joined students' organizations like COSAS, signals their determination and their preparedness to suffer for liberation. So any talk about this extra suffering that sanctions is going to bring is actually out of order completely. People have made that decision already. What they are saying is, you people outside can help us who have already started a process inside, and what your action is simply going to complement the pressure we're already putting on the state.
Cut. Chris, could you just repeat that, looking directly at the camera?
Okay.
You people outside,
Okay.
etc. Okay.
What I think the oppressed and exploited people inside the country are saying is that you people outside can join us in trying to dismantle the apartheid regime. Your action of calling for sanctions will just complement the work that we're already doing inside to put pressure on the regime.
Good. Chris, what message would you have for Christians in the United Kingdom and the world
Well,
in relation to the struggling people of South
Africa? Well, speaking as a person who's worked with the black community at a grassroots level, I would say that it's becoming increasingly difficult to convince the people that Christianity isn't and hasn't been an ally in the whole process of dominating and exploiting the people in South Africa. We've seen it internally, that apartheid in fact has used Christianity, has used the biblical message to justify that oppression. But I think it's wrong to see that it's only Christianity inside the country that has done that. More and more people are being convinced as they look at the record of so-called Christian countries like Britain or West Germany or Holland or the United States. People are finding it increasingly difficult to believe that Christianity is not an ally in the whole process of the exploitation and oppression of people. These people have been remarkably slow in coming to the aid of the people's struggle in South Africa through supporting the sanctions, for instance, the whole sanctions action. More and more people are beginning to question whether Christianity in fact has a role in a future South Africa. People at the grassroots level, I'm saying, because they're not seeing any relevant action coming from the Christian community, and because it's so closely identified with their process of oppression and exploitation. So what I would say to Christians in the Western countries is that you are going to have to make it very clear through a declaration and through your action, more important through your action, that Christianity isn't an ally in this process of exploitation and oppression of our people, and you have to distance yourself from this notion of Western Christian civilization. And I think a last point, and this is a very important one, I'm not mentioning it lastly because it's less important than the first. Christianity has been used in a whole so-called anti-communist crusade in all theaters of the third world where people are struggling for justice. You look at Nicaragua, you look at El Salvador, you look at South Africa, you look at the Philippines. Whenever the regime tries to legitimize its struggle for genuine freedom, for freedom from exploitation and oppression, they use this anti-communist ideology, and they try to draw Christianity into an alliance against godless communism, etc., etc. And I think it's incumbent on Christians, particularly in the West, to begin to challenge this misuse of Christianity, to downgrade the struggles in the third world in the sort of hostile, anti-communist sort of way. Does that make sense?
So we got out of this old lady. went back into the truck, went away. But I think she must have got about 26 from the rest, from all of us. But her stock had been thoroughly depleted. We have with us Reverend Graham Cray. We have with us Reverend Graham Cray, the vicar of St. Michael's, the Belfry. Graham Cray visited South Africa last year. Hello. We have with us Reverend Graham Cray of St. Michael's, the Belfry, New York. Graham Cray visited South Africa last year. You went along to South Africa. You went to South Africa last year. What was your impression of the condition of the blacks in that country?
Well, we were there from mid-January to late April '86. And we saw Crossroads, we saw the township of Lange, that's Cape Town Lange. We also went to Johannesburg and saw Soweto. And obviously it varies. Soweto has 5 millionaires, but it also has thousands of people, particularly those who are not meant to be there legally, living 3 families to a garage. But I think the worst conditions we saw were Crossroads. That was before all the troubles between the fathers and the comrades in June of that year. Up to 160,000 people living in shanties, some of them quite strong metal structures, some of them literally branches bent over and black polythene put over the top. The whole of that community had less than 40 standpipes as their water supply, had no sanitation, had no electric power, had nothing that I as a Westerner think of the basic facilities of life at all. And that was the hot season. For 3 months of the year it rains, and for 10 years the sanitation has been the sand on which the shanties are built, and therefore the mud is foul during the times of the year that it's muddy. And yet there was a spirit, a community spirit in Crossroads. There was at that stage a sense of hope. It was a community that had made a stand and had won at least temporarily the right to live where it had chosen to live. Whereas the townships, although the living conditions were at least a bit better, and there were some basic facilities, there was a tension. It shocked me that there were just 2 roads into an ordinary township. And Soweto, which is a vast community, our news says township. There's nearly 2 million people live in Soweto. It's one of the biggest cities in Africa. And there are just 4 roads in, so that 1,500 troops can seal off a community of that size. And I think I found the tension and the restrictions and the presence of heavily armed military and police patrols in the townships more difficult to take than the physical poverty and in some ways squalor, but pride of spirit in the actual townships. In the actual squatter camps themselves.
I see. Now, the Christian faith in South Africa has been thrown into a crisis. I believe this is the second time this happens. This takes place in South Africa. First, it took place during the South African War in 1898 to 1902. And this time, Christians, the clergy, have come up with a document that they published in September 1985, which they named Kairos Document. Would you want to say anything about it?
Yes. I think I probably need to explain what it is. That Kairos is a word from the Greek New Testament that means time, but it's not just time. It means that this is the time of opportunity, the time which, if it's lost, will be lost forever. The crisis that must be faced now, or there'll be tragic circumstances. And the Kairos document began with Christian leaders, obviously mainly black Christian leaders in Soweto, meeting together to say, what does our faith have to say and what is its relevance to the awful situation of oppression that we live in? And over a 3-month period of reflection, taking as their cue this idea that there is a crisis time and the gospel must be addressed to it now, they found that in fact they had to critique the stance of the churches before they could address the government, that the things in the gospel and the scriptures which challenge injustice of any sort and challenge racialism and challenge apartheid to its roots were not being challenged in many cases by the churches, or were being named in theory as being wrong, but nothing really being done about it. They put it under 3 headings. They talked about state theology, which really was the challenge to the Dutch Reformed Church, that it could not use the Bible to prop up racialism. But they also talked about church theology, and church theology really comes from the so-called English-speaking churches. That's a nonsense. Most people in them speak Xhosa or Zulu or something like that, but in common have the English rather than Afrikaans language in their liturgies, whose leaderships for the whole of the time of apartheid have tended to condemn it officially, but who often have a membership that believes that religion has nothing to do with politics and you must always obey the government, and you can say that you think something is wrong but you don't help the people to organise against it, and who in one sense had seemed to keep their hands clean by saying it's wrong, we won't have anything to do with it, but would actually do nothing to see it changed. There was no social analysis on the basis of the gospel, the Kairos document says in the Church Theology. And instead, these people who were involved with the grassroots struggle of the people said that there must be a prophetic theology, a theology that hears the cry of the people, that draws from the gospel and actually helps the people to come to their own liberation and challenges the power structures of evil.
The apologists of apartheid system, especially those who have a Christian bent, always refer to the Romans 13 and they would like people not to engage in political activity. What would be your answer to that?
Well, firstly, that I'm aware that that is used as a weapon. It's a classic example of a part of the Christian faith being taken out of context and then used as an ideological weapon to maintain an unjust system. One of my closest friends in South Africa, a black minister in Soweto, has himself been challenged by the police on the basis of that passage. I know Alan Buzak has had the same challenge and many others. And it simply is to fail to understand what Paul is saying. Romans 13 says that the state is the servant of God. Now that was written at a time when, if the Roman emperor had been able to get hold of Paul at a time of writing that, he'd have had his head off his shoulders for it. Because as far as the Roman emperor was concerned, the state was the servant of nobody. The state had the absolute right to decide exactly what would happen without restraint. And when Paul comes along and says, no, it's a servant, it has limits to what it can do and it has responsibilities and it's got to be about justice and it's got to be about the punishment of wrongdoing, it clearly means that no Christian is called to actively support a state that is an agent of wrongdoing rather than is an opponent of it. In addition to that, the creed which the early Christians had was that Jesus is Lord. Now that's political, because the way you showed you were a good supporter of the Roman state, which was a very oppressive state, it was sometimes benevolent, but it was repressive, was to say Caesar is Lord, and to burn a pinch of incense to one of his statues, claiming that he was a god. Christians would not do that. Hundreds of thousands of Christians in the first decades of the church were martyred rather than give the state absolute authority. Paul himself had his head taken from his shoulders by Caesar's executioner. because he would not give the state absolute value, and because he said that the claims of Jesus Christ came first. So what you have in Romans 13 is the state being put in its place, and a statement that when it does that, Christians are to go with it. But that rather than give up the absolute place of Jesus, Christians should be willing to lose their lives rather than submit.
Now, in the context of the South African situation, what does this imply? Does it imply that Christians should openly defy the state?
In certain circumstances, without doubt, it means that. It means that no Christian can be an anarchist. You cannot say there can be no order, no authority. No one may tell me what to do. I will live my life as I choose. You have to accept that there has to be some law to be justice, and there have to be some agencies that carry that out. But Christians are continually called to obey God first. And the moment the state becomes an instrument of injustice, it's the Christian duty of all believers in Jesus Christ to refuse to obey. Now, my personal commitment is that that should be a matter of non-violence, but that I believe in active civil disobedience to unjust laws as a Christian duty.
Now, Father Cray, you say you believe in non-violence. But is there space, do you see space for non-violent political activity in South Africa with the actual apartheid state itself being so violent against its own people? Do you see space for non-violence?
I understand the problem, and no one is in a position who is not living in a township or in a squatter camp is in a position to make moral judgments about those who find that violence is the only way that they can express their outrage and their demand for liberation and their need to be heard. It's simply that there are two Christian traditions about violence and warfare. One believes that there can be a just war and therefore a just revolution. And on the basis of that tradition, there can be armed resistance to an unjust state. And there is a theological basis for it. It's just that my personal conviction is to be part of the other tradition that says that violence always leads to violence, that retaliation always leads to retaliation, and there has to be a way of, at great cost, challenging violence by non-violence and actually breaking that spiral. And I still believe there is mileage in South Africa for that. I still believe that the South African Defence Force knows exactly what to do when it meets violence, and it is actually thrown and bewildered by strong non-violent protest. And sometimes because it is thrown and bewildered, it meets it with violence because it doesn't know how to react, and that is entirely unjust. But I believe there is still room for those who wish to see an active resistance in non-violent terms as part of building a future just nation.
Yes, thank you for that. But if we remember well, during the South African War, the British Church was on the side of British administration against the Afrikaners. And they went about mobilizing here in England in support of the war. Now, why would it be wrong for the blacks in South Africa to adopt a similar stand?
I don't believe it's morally wrong for the blacks to adopt that stand, but I do believe that Christians have extra moral and ethical demands laid upon them. Just because some Christians have said the gospel is nothing to do with politics and we mustn't be involved and have misinterpreted Romans 13 and therefore have not actively disobeyed, as I believe the gospel demands, doesn't necessarily mean that the Christian way of costly involvement to bring justice, and it is justice and not just some contentless reconciliation that we're talking about here, that it necessarily means that Christians automatically are to turn to violence, but it also means that they're not to judge quickly those who do. And now, talking about the South African War, quite clearly at that stage, although the blacks will have preferred the British to win rather than the Boer to win to some extent, because there was a possibility of a slightly less racialist society if that happened. Essentially, they were on the sidelines. As happened with the Falklands crisis, for instance, in my country, British Christians start talking about Britain winning, and Argentine Christians start talking about Argentina winning, and no one actually thinks that maybe the kingdom of God is about a just solution, however much it costs both nations. Now, I believe that the Christians in any country have a higher loyalty than even their own national group's liberation, and that calls them to stand in a costly way for justice, but in a way which accords with God's kingdom.
Going back to the documents we're discussing, I noticed that the evangelicals have published their own critique. What would you attribute this sudden change in outlook?
Well, like Kairos, this concerned evangelical statement actually came out of Soweto. It was in part a response to Kairos. Many of them, and evangelicals are a more traditional group of Christians usually, met together. And the main thing is that they live in Soweto. On one of the occasions while they were meeting together, they actually saw the security forces, beating school children and things like that. That they are aware that there is oppression. They are aware that the Bible talks about injustice as well as personal sin. And they met to respond to Kairos, but felt that they simply could not because the track record of their own Christian tradition was so poor, and that though they might beg to differ with bits and pieces of Kairos, they felt it stood far more in line with the Bible, which is their central book, than what their own tradition had actually done. And they came to the conclusions that evangelicals didn't apply their faith evenly, and that they were great on personal sin, but were not taking injustice seriously. And they felt that they had no integrity criticizing Kairos. Rather, they actually had to criticize the stance of their own tradition and its ignoring of injustice.
Would you agree that the South African government is actually Christian?
No government is actually Christian.
They claim
many of the individuals in it are obviously practicing Christians. Many of them are elders of the Dutch Reformed Church. But I believe their religion is nationalism. Their God is actually their volk. They have used the Christian faith as an ideology to support some idea of the special right to rule of the Afrikaner people. And they then use that as an excuse for oppression. They are using the Christian faith, but they don't actually really recognize that their nation is their God. And the moment the Christian faith is subordinated to anything, Caesar becomes Lord again rather than Jesus, and the Christian faith becomes abused. So it is not a Christian position, although many of them are devout Christians who totally fail to understand how they are denying their faith in the whole of their political life.
Churches place their funds in trusts, and many of these trusts invest in companies that operate in South Africa. Now there is a call from the people of South Africa for sanctions. What do you think the church should do in support of the call?
Support it totally. I have no doubt that in every secure private conversation with black Christians that I had in South Africa, they were not naive about sanctions. They neither believed that they would bring liberation overnight, and they certainly believed that they could be costly to them. But they were absolutely clear that they were suffering so much already that the difference would be marginal, and they wanted the international support that was growing in response to the worldwide public view of their struggles. So I believe it should be supported to the hilt, and all the talk about the extra suffering it will cause simply fails to understand that since '76 a whole generation of young blacks have said we would rather die than hand this on to our children.
It has been said that the churches would have no power over the administration of their funds once the funds have been placed in the trust. What have you to say?
There are some difficulties about the interpretation of trust law. When money is for charitable purposes in this country, it has strict legal limits as to how it may be spent. And for instance, the church commissioners of the Church of England, who are not controlled by the General Synod of the Church of England, only advised by the General Synod, claim that trust law would not allow themselves to disinvest just because there are moral and ethical reasons. Many of us believe that that is actually a misinterpretation of the law. I do not believe that trust law prevents changes. For instance, the church commissioners do not invest in armaments firms and do not invest in tobacco firms. And if you won't support the weapons of regimes, why should you support in things that will actually prop up their injustice when they get their weapons elsewhere? It's a sincere argument, but I believe it's a misinterpretation of the law and it needs to be challenged until we get it right.
What would be your message to the British Christians over the question of South Africa?
That your fellow Christians in South Africa are wanting to see whether you really are brother or sister in Christ to them. That they are deciding not only whether you care about them, but whether you are the sort of friend that they actually want to have once apartheid is overthrown, as it surely will be, and that your contribution and your prayer and your active support can contribute to that being less bloody than it might be. And you are deciding about your relationship with a future nation, not just whether or not you are prepared to be involved in a struggle now. But if you're not prepared for that involvement to be costly, then you are not a friend that will want to be known in a future nation.
Thank you.
So I deliberately went...
I think so. We shall have assembled and gone.
Just don't say anything, bro. Just look interested.
Very well. Oh, I borrowed the Bible. And I don't have a Bible at home.
Start.
You went to South Africa last year. What was your impression of the conditions of the blacks in that country?
Start.
You went to South Africa last year. What was your impression of the conditions of the blacks in that country?
Cut.
You see, I don't know what you mean.
Start.
Christian faith in South Africa is at the moment undergoing a crisis. Christians themselves have produced documents, the Kairos Document and the Evangelical Critique, in which they have criticized their own role in the social situation of the country and found themselves to have been actively buttressing the racist system. Do you want to have anything to say to that?
Cut. Start.
Christian faith is at the moment undergoing a crisis in South Africa. Christians themselves have examined their own situation and found themselves to have been actually actively buttressing the repressive system. They have come up with documents, the Kairos Document and the Evangelical Critique. Please tell us what the Kairos Document is about.
Cut. Begin.
White Christians in South Africa have always referred to the Romans 13, where St. Paul appears to have preaching obedience to a government of the day. Is it true that that is what St. Paul meant?
Cut.
What should be the role of Christians in an oppressive state like that of South Africa? Going back to the documents, the evangelicals produced their own critique. What would you attribute this sudden change in outlook to? Would you agree that the South African government is actually Christian? Churches place their funds in trusts that invest in companies that are operating in South Africa. There is a call from the people of South Africa for sanctions. What do you think the church should do in support of the call? It has been said that churches would have no power in the administration of their funds after these funds have been placed in the trusts. What have you to say to that? Am I right like this? Am I nice?
That's all right, yes. Can you take your hand away? No. Can you smile?
Okay. Ian Linden, the people of South Africa have asked the world for internationally imposed sanctions. Now, the position of the churches in England is that they place their funds with trusts over which they claim they have no control once their funds have been placed with them, in that they cannot dictate to the trust that they should not invest in South African firms. Now, but we know that churches stipulated that their funds should not be invested in liquor and tobacco undertaking businesses. So, what is your view over the whole situation of sanctions?
I like to look at it in this way, that for 100 years almost, the West and business, and indeed the churches, have been investing in the South African economy. And over that period of 100 years, we've seen South Africa move from an apartheid system into a national security system, into a burgeoning civil war. So constructive engagement, believing that money will alter apartheid, clearly is untrue. It does alter apartheid, but it alters apartheid into growing levels of civil unrest, civil conflict, and revolution. Investment in South Africa is investment in the preconditions for a revolution of, I would say, Iranian proportions. For that reason, it's pretty obvious that it was high time for the churches to think in a different direction, to investigate the possibilities of disinvestment, of economic sanctions against South Africa. And indeed, a number of British churches have passed resolutions to this end, advocating sanctions, advocating strategies of disinvestment. A number of churches and dioceses have disinvested. The Catholic Archdiocese of Westminster, for example, disinvested from Consolidated Goldfields in 1977. The rationale behind disinvestment is essentially a political one, that the trajectory on which South Africa finds itself is towards a major civil war with horrendous levels of bloodshed possible. This was the conclusions of the Eminent Persons Group, and there is no evidence at all to discount their conclusions coming from South Africa in the present day. Therefore, if this bloodshed is to be brought to an end, it was best that it would be brought to a speedy end. And the logic of sanctions and the logic of disinvestment, as the churches see it, is to make this period of turmoil and this transfer to a democratic, unitary South Africa as brief as possible, so that South Africa does not turn into a wasteland and a land of economic ruin, so that the people of South Africa inherit a viable economy rather than ruins. And this, I think, is the thinking behind the disinvestment and sanctions measures that the churches are taking. Certainly there are some churches, and I would cite the church commissioners of the Anglican Church, who, as you've rightly pointed out, have not followed through the logic of ethical investment that they have strongly adhered to in the case of liquor and armaments, and they haven't really taken that logic further forward and thought about the implications of their continued investment in companies who have relationships with South Africa. But there is obviously a process going on as a number of British churches do take steps and do take measures of an economic kind. And this is obviously a very important moral development, a development in the moral consciousness of the churches here. How far this is going to go, I think, remains to be seen.
Now, my second question to you is concerning the decision of the South African Catholic laity, that the statement they made shortly before the May 6 general elections in South Africa. One of the points they have said is to tell the membership that it has to familiarize itself with the mushrooming number of non-racial extra-parliamentary organizations. Now, by implication, this includes the African National Congress of South Africa. Now, we would like to know what would be the position of the CIIR in relation to this, and what forms of support will the CIIR give to the struggling people of South Africa?
It seems to me that the recommendation of the South African Council of the Catholic Laity was only common sense. And it would be very easy to misunderstand what this recommendation was from a European perspective, because when in Europe we talk about extra-parliamentary opposition, we normally talk about groups of people who are deliberately choosing not to participate in parliamentary democracy. Now, obviously, in the case of South Africa, this is completely different. Black people in South Africa are not deliberately choosing not to participate in parliamentary democracy. They are forced by the system into methods of expressing their political wishes and their desires for the future of their country, which are extra-parliamentary. They are not allowed in the tricameral parliament. That was the whole purpose of setting up the three-chambered parliament in 1984. So extra-parliamentary is not a sort of bizarre thing to be doing in the South African context. It's the only thing that black people are left with in that particular system. And as such, it is only common sense for Catholics in South Africa to study in a great degree of detail what black people are saying through the only available institutions that they have for expressing their wishes. And I would discount the black councils, which clearly do not represent black people and were not voted in by anything more than 15% of the black vote. And I would obviously discount the Bantustans, which equally clearly do not have the support of the majority of their citizens or the citizens of the rural areas of South Africa. the institutions that very obviously, and one would have to be blind not to see it, the institutions that do have the support of the majority of people in South Africa are the affiliated organizations of the United Democratic Front. And these organizations have evidently been severely repressed by the South African state with the goal of stifling dissent, stifling the only available institutions through which black people can speak. The attempt has been made to criminalize what are perfectly ordinary democratic institutions through which people are trying to talk about their future, because they have no other way. Now, the position of the Catholic Institute on these institutions and these organizations is that they are the last available channels for non-violent expression of black opinion in South Africa. Institutions like the South African state, the security forces and the army that lock up and put in prison the leaders of these organizations and groups are deliberately stimulating, it seems to me, the only other possible method of bringing about change in South Africa, which is a violent method of armed struggle. If you cut off even these simple non-violent democratic institutions, what are black people left with to struggle with? They're clearly left with the armed struggle. So to repress and crush these institutions, as we have seen in the last 2 years when almost 70% of the United Democratic Front's leadership has either been detained, gone into hiding, or in some cases even been murdered, is for somebody in Europe the most extraordinarily foolish action, and one designed to stimulate conditions of civil war. And our position would be that it is essential, if there is to be any peaceful progress in South Africa, for these legitimate democratic institutions to be given the opportunity of expressing the will of the people of South Africa. And without that, there is no alternative but this very slow, painful and bloody descent into civil war that we're seeing at the moment.
Wait, before you finish, we have to ask a question about
Yes.
As it was nice and spontaneous.
Yeah. We've seen in the last few years the most extraordinary proliferation of security laws in South Africa. There always were a lot of security laws, but in the last few years, particularly in relation to the press, in relation to democratic organizations, there's the most amazing growth, a whole web of security laws, making it almost impossible to do anything of a democratic nature without contravening the law. So quite naturally, the whole issue now of civil disobedience or breaking these laws has become very acute for the churches. And I think the churches face a major problem in this issue of breaking the law. For many blacks, breaking the law is a perfectly natural thing to do because they can hardly live and move and work without breaking the law under the Group Areas Act or different vagrancy laws and so on. But for church people, very often the idea of breaking the law is anathema, and now they're having to think again because they're finding it increasingly difficult to be the church and to act as the church without contravening 1 or 2 or 3 of the new provisions that have come into force. Under these circumstances, I think the experience of civil disobedience for the churches will be a very fundamental turning point, because by breaking the law, the churches and church people will find themselves on the same side of the tracks as the majority of black people. And that experience of being arrested for minor offences, being pulled into jail for having organised a prayer meeting or of having organised some kind of protest meeting about detainees, that experience, I think, will bring them closer to the majority of the black people and will result in a new attitude to the state. Because on the whole, the churches start out from the supposition that the state is the legitimate lawgiver and that people opposed to these laws are the transgressor and not to be supported. I think their recent experience is making them reconsider very strongly that position. And I think this will have immense implications for the future of the different churches in South Africa.
The Kairos document, I think, says that Christians actually have a moral duty to disobey the law. Is that right?
The Kairos document suggests, obviously, that Christians should disobey unjust laws, that they don't have any alternative but disobey unjust laws, because in the final analysis, the mission of the Church is a mission of seeking justice and of seeking peace. And there very obviously can be no peace in South Africa before a just society is created. And under those circumstances, it's not so much that you have a choice. As a Christian, you have no alternative.